The invitation had come casually, wrapped in the comfort of routine. He was a friend of a friend, someone she had met a handful of times at weekend gatherings, charming in a mild, unassuming way. There had never been anything unsettling about him. If anything, he had always come across as a little too quiet, the type who smiled at the right moments but never stayed too long in conversations. When he invited her to his countryside home for a weekend getaway, she had hesitated at first. The world had been chaotic lately, and the thought of getting away from city noise, phone notifications, and artificial lighting had its own appeal. He offered space, calm, and seclusion. It sounded harmless. It sounded perfect. She said yes. The drive was longer than she expected, winding through dense forest roads where the GPS often blinked out, leaving her to rely on vague verbal instructions. The air changed as she moved further from the city. It became thicker, quieter, the sort of silence that hummed in your ears when no other sound existed. When she finally arrived, the house stood still and proud at the edge of a wooded hill, its exterior aged but clean. Ivy climbed along the old brick walls. A wooden deck wrapped around one side, and large windows reflected the surrounding trees like black mirrors. The place was rustic, isolated, and stunning in a way that made her feel both enchanted and slightly small. He greeted her with that same easy smile, his presence familiar enough to keep her at ease. He carried her bag inside and showed her around. The inside of the house was tastefully furnished, with warm wood tones and shelves lined with books. A fireplace had already been lit, and the smell of something cooking in the kitchen drifted through the open space. Everything was comfortable. Every detail had been prepared in advance. The guest room had fresh linen, a vase of wildflowers, even a handwritten welcome note. Nothing about it felt improvised. The first few hours passed peacefully. They shared tea, talked lightly about their mutual friends, discussed books and films. He seemed attentive but never pushy. He had that careful tone of someone who had spent a lot of time alone and had learned how to speak without making others uncomfortable. She had brought her phone out a few times to check reception, which flickered in and out but worked well enough to reassure her. The idea of spending a quiet weekend writing, reading, and walking among trees was starting to feel like a gift. When she went to bed that first night, she felt a calm she hadn't experienced in months. She woke early as sunlight poured through the window in thin, gold streaks. The house was quiet. She walked barefoot down the hallway, expecting to find him in the kitchen, but instead, she found the front door bolted. Not just locked but bolted, chained, and latched in a way she hadn't noticed before. There were multiple locks all engaged. She assumed he had done so overnight, maybe for safety. When he eventually emerged from the back hallway, he offered her breakfast, small talk, and nothing unusual. When she asked about the locks, he simply nodded and said he must have done it out of habit. She laughed lightly. It was a strange detail, but not yet threatening. He promised to unlock it later when they went out for a walk. But the walk never happened. It began to rain, slow at first, then heavy. He suggested staying in and playing a game instead. She agreed. By evening, the rain hadn't stopped, and the mood inside the house had grown cozier. He brought out wine, they cooked together, and he told her more about the house's history. He had inherited it from a distant relative, and most of the furniture and books had belonged to that person. He spoke about the house with reverence, as though it were more than a place, almost like a living thing that had kept him company. She listened, amused by his growing eccentricity. That night, something felt different. As she prepared for bed, she checked the door again. Still locked. The keys were not in their place near the entrance. She remembered seeing them on a hook earlier that day. Now they were gone. She asked him about it the next morning. He shrugged, told her he must have put them somewhere and would find them soon. He said it so casually, as though the thought of misplacing the only way out of the house wasn't even worth stressing over. She let it go, thinking he'd find them eventually. But something in his tone made her hesitate. The second day passed with a similar rhythm. They cooked, read, and talked. But he never left her alone for long. Every time she moved to a different room, he followed shortly after. If she lingered too long near a window, he'd ask if she needed anything. If she went to the bathroom, he'd check in moments later with some reason to speak to her through the door. It wasn't overtly strange, but it was noticeable. His presence had begun to feel heavier, like a hand always on her shoulder. She couldn't tell if he was just overly hospitable or something else entirely. She laughed it off again. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe the isolation had made him forget normal boundaries. But by the third morning, the boundaries were clearly gone. When she woke and checked her phone, there was no service at all. Not a flicker. She tried the Wi-Fi but the network was gone. The password no longer worked. She approached him directly about it, this time more seriously, and he smiled with an almost apologetic expression. He said the storm must have knocked something out. He didn't seem concerned. When she pressed again, he said maybe this was a sign to unplug for a while to stay present. She stared at him. Something in his eyes didn't match his voice. The calm didn't reach his gaze. There was a flicker of something behind it, desperation perhaps. A quiet, hungry kind of obsession. She went to the door again, this time intending to open it herself, to at least test the locks. They were not only engaged but sealed with an extra chain she hadn't seen before. One of the screws had been replaced with a metal plate. She asked for the key directly. He didn't answer. Instead, he offered her tea. She stood in silence, staring at him, and repeated the request. He hesitated. His face didn't change, but his voice lowered. He said she didn't need it right now. That it wasn't safe outside. That she could trust him. That the world was complicated out there, and in here they were safe. He smiled again. And something inside her shifted from curiosity to fear. She returned to her room slowly, every sense heightened. She took inventory of what she had: her phone, a charger, a small knife from the kitchen she had tucked into her sleeve when he wasn't looking. She started checking the windows. Every one of them had screws in the sills or latches that didn't open. The back door was blocked by a heavy wooden bar from the inside. There was no exit she could find that didn't require a key or his permission. And she knew then, with a sharp clarity that cut through all excuses, that he had never misplaced the key. He had taken it. Deliberately. Quietly. And the question now was no longer how to leave, but how long he had planned to keep her there. The awareness of captivity settled over her like a second skin, tightening with every breath as the hours stretched into a day defined only by his rhythms and the boundaries of walls that no longer felt architectural but anatomical. The ribs of a creature determined to keep its prey alive and still. She mapped the house in her mind, each corner memorized in the hush of his footsteps, noting how he moved with an almost ceremonial precision, lights switched on at the same dim setting, curtains drawn to identical lengths, doors that once creaked now oiled and silent, suggesting preparation long before her arrival. When he disappeared into the basement for stretches of time, she pressed her ear to the solid door and caught fragments of metallic clatter, the soft hiss of plastic being unwrapped, and the low murmur of a radio tuned to crackling static. All indications of a stockpile and perhaps a private broadcast meant only for him. Her phone lay useless on the dresser, stripped of signal, its screen flashing a desperate search for towers she knew surrounded the countryside. Somewhere inside the house a jammer must have been humming, invisible but absolute. She discovered that the landline in the study, which he claimed still worked, was a shell, receiver intact, wiring severed, the loose copper ends taped like arteries cauterized to prevent bleeding information. In the afternoon she feigned interest in the books lining the living room shelves, but her gaze fixed on the small surveillance camera tucked among leather spines, its lens dark, yet she could feel the possibility of recording. A silent witness that could be activated at will. She tested each window again. Every latch had been replaced by screws drilled so deep the heads were filed smooth, impossible to loosen without specialized tools, while thin sheets of sheet metal were tacked behind the wooden frames, invisible at first glance, transforming glass into decorative illusions of escape. She listened to him speak with growing fervor about storms of chaos sweeping the cities, crowds clawing for supplies, and a government blackout that would last months, his narrative shifting timelines and details each retelling, braided together by a single refrain that out there meant danger and in here meant salvation. With dusk came generators humming to life, small portable units hidden somewhere beyond her line of sight, their vibration seeping through floorboards as overhead bulbs flickered with an amber glow that flattened shadows but never banished them. In the kitchen she located drawers where utensils should have been and found only blunt objects, each knife replaced by a dull replica with a blunted edge, suggesting he anticipated her thoughts before she dared to enact them. She traced the seams of the wall searching for weak points and noticed hairline cracks in the paint that revealed a recent coat, beneath it a faint outline of writing, phrases crudely sanded but still discernible. Stay indoors, trust the plan, day 219. Proof that his confinement fantasy had lived here well before she crossed the threshold. Whenever their paths crossed he radiated a fragile serenity, hands folded behind his back, head tilted in careful sympathy as he asked about her comfort, her rest, her willingness to participate in shared meals. And though his voice remained soft the cadence betrayed tightening screws in his psyche, sentences peppered with non-existent alarms and fabricated advisories as though he were a lone anchor on a news channel broadcasting exclusively to her. She tested him once by asking for a weather update she already knew from memory of the forecast. He delivered a report of torrential winds and collapsing roads, eyes shining with conviction, oblivious to the calm evening visible through the slits of the curtains. Later, while he prepared a stew whose aroma masked the metallic tang of kerosene wafting from the fireplace, she slipped into his study and opened a locked drawer using a thin nail file saved from her toiletry bag. Inside lay notebooks formatted like military logs, each page dated with an alternate calendar beginning not with months but with containment cycles, entries tallying food rations, incident responses, and behavioral observations of cohabitants. Yet every cohabitant column before her name was crossed out in thick strokes, raising the question of predecessors who had failed the role he assigned them. She replaced the notebook precisely, heart pounding a metronome beneath her ribs, and returned to the hallway before the whisper of his slippers approached. Night brought a fresh orchestra of engineered isolation, storm shutters she had not seen unfurled from hidden recesses outside each window, slamming shut with hydraulic finality, while Vince exhaled a medicated scent that thinned the air, dulling her focus until she wrapped a scarf around her mouth and nose. She paced the guest room counting seconds between his hallway passes, deducing a pattern of 13 minutes on average, leaving brief pockets in which she rummaged through closets for coat hangers, belts, anything that might serve as tools. She discovered behind a row of old coats a narrow panel and pried it loose to find a crawlspace barely wide enough for her shoulders. It led toward the attic, but a rusted padlock barred the opening from the other side. A small mercy of oversight she hoped to exploit later. She noted the screws, measured them against the edge of the nail file, and calculated time. At 3 a.m., when his footsteps at last subsided and the generator's drone steadied, she began working one screw free, twisting slowly to mute each metallic groan, sweat beading despite the cold. It took 34 minutes to loosen 2 screws before the creak of the hallway floorboards froze her in place. She replaced the panel and slid beneath the covers, feigning sleep as the door eased open and his silhouette lingered. The faint gleam of a key on a chain swinging like a pendulum above his chest, its metallic glint marking the heartbeat of her captivity. When he withdrew, she exhaled soundlessly, clutching the nail file beneath the blanket, her thoughts crystallizing into strategy. Daylight would bring feigned compliance, but night would be for progress, every minute a thread in the rope she intended to weave toward freedom. Yet beneath the resolve lay the growing realization that the house itself, wired, bolted, and watched, was not merely his shelter but an accomplice, a labyrinth designed to erode will. And that escape would require unraveling not just locks of steel but the binds of his unraveling mind before they both snapped under the strain. She awoke to the low hum of static. It filtered through the floorboards like a persistent whisper, not quite music and not quite silence, a sound that made the hairs on her arms rise before her eyes even opened. The house felt colder than the night before, the air brittle in her lungs. As she lay still, pretending to remain asleep, she listened for the familiar rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway. They didn't come. Instead, she heard the shuffling of paper, the squeak of a chair leg, the occasional sharp click of something metallic. He was awake. And he was doing something downstairs. Slipping out from beneath the blanket, she moved soundlessly toward the window. The shutters were still down, casting a sickly yellow tint over the dim room. She pressed her fingers lightly against the seams of the wood panel she had worked on the night before. The screws she had loosened were still slightly ajar. Hope flickered. She would keep going when the house allowed. But this morning her goal was not escape, it was answers. She needed to understand how far gone he was, what kind of thinking had brought him to believe this captivity was necessary, and more importantly, how deep into delusion he had sunk. She padded down the hallway with deliberate silence. Every floorboard had been memorized, the creaking ones marked in her mind as danger zones. From the top of the stairs, she could see the door to his study wide open, an unusual sight. She crept closer. The static grew louder as she descended, the low-frequency murmur now clearly coming from an old radio set balanced on a table beside a disassembled VCR, torn-out wiring, and several annotated maps spread open and tacked to the walls. The house had transformed since she first arrived. It was no longer a cabin retreat, it was a bunker. A fortress of obsession. Shelves now bore labels written in permanent marker. Batteries, iodine, storm masks, gas tablets. She had never seen them before. Either they had been hidden or he had brought them out in preparation for a long haul. His voice broke the silence. He wasn't talking to her. He was recording something, his tone calm but authoritative, listing what sounded like emergency steps and daily logs. She recognized the cadence. He was mimicking the broadcast tone of a government alert system. A single microphone was placed beside the radio, plugged into a dusty tape deck that was slowly spooling as he spoke. He paused between sentences, rewound, played back, and corrected himself. There were no listeners. This wasn't performance. It was ritual. She watched him from behind the doorframe, his posture slightly hunched, his attention hyper-focused. He looked thinner than she remembered from just days earlier, or maybe her perception had shifted. His hair was uncombed, his skin waxy in the half-light. The key still hung around his neck. She imagined it as a chain not of brass but of control, a symbol of the barrier between freedom and this curated captivity. He glanced up, sensing movement perhaps, and she stepped back in time, her heart thudding. Moments later he emerged with a fresh calm on his face and offered her breakfast. She accepted it, feigned interest, mimicked ease. He seemed soothed by her compliance. Throughout the day he kept her close. He asked her questions, not about herself, but about her feelings regarding the outside world. Did she believe the news? Did she trust the government? Did she think society had decayed beyond repair? His voice was gentle, coaxing, as if trying to lead her into agreement, into confirming the worldview he was feeding her day by day. When she remained vague, he seemed neither satisfied nor disturbed, but filed her responses away like data for a future analysis. She began to see how everything around her was part of a constructed narrative. The food was rationed by calorie and expiration date, the clocks reset to arbitrary times, all the mirrors removed from the house. Only reflective surfaces she couldn't access, windows sealed from the outside, remained. By late afternoon he invited her into what he called the planning room. It was a converted spare bedroom, and it chilled her to the core. Charts covered the walls, drawn in color-coded markers, outlining zones of safe passage, lists of supplies, and grids of dates that corresponded with nothing she recognized. A whiteboard had her name written in the center, surrounded by keywords: adaptable, emotionally neutral, non-threatening, low external ties. He had profiled her. The phrases were clinical, as if written by someone studying a subject rather than sharing space with a person. Underneath, a final word, stay, underlined 3 times in red. She feigned curiosity and asked soft, encouraging questions. He responded with monologues. He believed the outside world was on the verge of collapse. He spoke of social fabric unraveling, of a virus released in secret, of communication networks controlled by unseen hands. He referenced early signals she had never heard of, facts fabricated or twisted. To him, this house was not a trap, it was the ark. And she wasn't a prisoner. She was the chosen. That night, she sat alone in the guest room and processed what she had seen. There was no convincing him of reality. To argue would be to trigger panic, confrontation, or worse, an escalation. The only path forward was to deepen the illusion of compliance until an opening revealed itself. She began keeping her own record, writing messages on torn strips of napkin, stuffing them behind loose bricks in the fireplace and beneath floorboards. If she disappeared, she wanted a trail, something that would speak for her. In the middle of the night, she awoke to a strange sound, metal scraping against tile. She left the bed quietly and followed the noise. At the edge of the hallway, she saw him crouched in the kitchen, rearranging the furniture. He wasn't aware she was watching. From a concealed latch in the floor, he lifted a steel case. Inside were more notebooks, a camera, and what looked like old ID cards not belonging to him. Some were female. She saw photos. Faces. People who had once stood where she now stood. Her breath caught. She stepped back without sound and returned to bed. The shadows on the wall seemed to grow longer. She didn't sleep. Not this night. Not anymore. The house was no longer just a cage, it was a graveyard of forgotten stories, rewritten by a man who had made himself both historian and warden. She began to count the days differently. Not in hours of light and darkness, but in steps toward the moment she would leave. Or not leave. She didn't yet know. But the planning had begun. The days began to stretch in strange ways, no longer tethered to sunlight or clocks, but to his moods, which shifted like weather fronts moving in without warning. She learned to read the smallest cues, the way he opened a cabinet, the exact cadence of his breath when he climbed the stairs, the subtle flick of his hand when something displeased him. It wasn't fear that drove her focus, not exactly, it was necessity. Survival within this warped domestic order required constant attention, a willingness to submerge her own rhythm beneath the erratic tides of his routines. She developed a kind of sixth sense for when he needed to feel in control and when he required silence. Each morning she played the role perfectly. She thanked him for breakfast, commented on the weather she could not see, asked questions she already knew answers to, praised his foresight about the outside world. He responded like a man being finally understood. He seemed calmer. Almost pleased. That pleased her, too, because calm meant access, and access meant opportunity. She began testing limits again. Nothing overt, nothing fast. She asked if she could clean certain rooms herself, offering the excuse that it gave her a sense of purpose. He agreed cautiously. She started with small gestures, reorganizing books, wiping windows, dusting corners. What she was really doing was searching. Mapping. Every drawer, every wall, every hollow panel. In a closet tucked behind the bedroom door, she discovered a fuse box hidden behind a pane of thin drywall. The lock was primitive. She didn't tamper with it, but she marked it in her mind. Electricity could be a tool or a weapon. He introduced new rituals. Each evening, they sat for what he called reflection, a quiet hour where they would write down their thoughts on paper and share one thing they learned that day. She wrote carefully constructed pieces, neither too optimistic nor too negative, always threaded with gratitude. He read hers like scripture. He shared thoughts that disturbed her in their serenity, reflections on the virtue of isolation, on the cleansing nature of silence, on how human connection only created disorder when left unchecked. He spoke of her as though she had been chosen to prove that balance was still possible, that two people could exist in perfect equilibrium without the need for the chaos of the outer world. She listened with stillness, nodding at the right times, even when her stomach turned. During a walk through the corridor that connected the main house to a locked side room, she noticed a faint hum coming from behind the bolted door. It was mechanical and steady, unlike the generator hum she had come to know. When she asked about it, he responded vaguely, mentioning temperature regulation or backup systems. But that night, when he stepped out to tend the water tank outside, she used a bent spoon handle to wedge the door slightly. Inside was a soundproof room with padded walls, several blankets stacked in a corner, and restraints on the floor, not for safety, but for confinement. The implications shook her. She closed the door before he returned, her face composed despite the tremor beneath her skin. She began to build her exit plan more seriously. The attic panel, now halfway loosened, would be her route. Each night she continued unscrewing quietly, hiding the hardware behind the baseboards. The crawl space was tight but passable. She memorized the angles. She began storing water in hidden spots, rationing food for meals by slipping extra biscuits or dried fruit into her sleeves. She found a flashlight in a drawer labeled Outdoor Emergency Use Only and stashed it beneath a loose floor plank in her room. Every action was slow, deliberate. One misstep, one shift in his perception, and the fragile illusion of peace would fracture. He began pacing more, talking to himself when he thought she was asleep. His words were fragmented, snippets of imagined conversations, references to people she had never met. He would stop suddenly and stare at the wall, then turn away as if embarrassed. One morning she caught him scribbling on the wall in pencil, diagrams and lines connecting shapes like a mind mapping connections between events that did not exist. When he noticed her watching, he smiled too widely, erased it with a cloth, and said he had been thinking aloud. She agreed. She agreed with everything. Agreeing was safe. The outside world had become myth. He never referenced news anymore, only his own updates, charts pinned on corkboards, fictional broadcasts played through the old radio, coded messages that he said proved his theories. She asked once if he would ever share these messages with others. His face hardened. Others couldn't be trusted. She was the only one who hadn't laughed at him. The only one who had stayed. That word stayed echoed in her mind long after he left the room. Then one afternoon, a mistake happened. While sweeping the storage room, she found an envelope tucked between two books. It contained photographs of other women, candid shots like those taken from afar, through windows, on sidewalks, unaware. Her stomach turned. Some of them were circled in red marker. On the back of each, short notes. Too loud, refused to eat, asked too many questions. She tucked the envelope back where it was and returned to the kitchen, her hands trembling beneath the table. He noticed nothing or pretended not to. The weight of those photographs lingered. She was not the first. She might not be the last. That knowledge sealed her resolve. She accelerated her plan. She stopped sleeping through the night, taking cat naps during the day instead, so she could work at night without hesitation. She waited until she was certain of his sleep patterns. She stopped responding emotionally, became flat in tone, mirror-like in reaction. It worked. He relaxed again, believing she had settled that the system he built was finally perfect. He gave her a journal and suggested she start documenting her journey of transformation. She did. She wrote carefully worded reflections about detachment from modern dependence, about inner peace through silence, about discovering self without the chaos of relationships. He smiled when he read them, a smile filled with delusional pride. He began calling her the proof. She smiled back. But underneath each written line, she kept a second version of truth in invisible ink, lemon juice she had managed to request under the guise of herbal remedies. A thin thread of invisible witness to everything he was hiding, to everything she had seen. And still each night the screws turned. The panel loosened. Her muscles adapted to the angles of the crawlspace. The house was memorized. The man was studied. The illusion was complete. All she needed now was a moment. A trigger. A gap. She knew it would come. Not because he would make a mistake, but because men like him always do. She woke to the sound of the key turning in the front door. Not a lock being opened, but tested, jiggled, confirmed. A habit he repeated every morning, always before she stirred, as if to ensure nothing had shifted during the night. No bolt undone, no door misaligned, no escape attempted. But this time she heard the breath he held as he turned it, the slight hesitation. She was being tested. He suspected something. Maybe it was the rearranged broom in the hallway, or the drawer she forgot to close all the way after replacing a tool. Maybe it was just instinct. He had been quiet the day before, too quiet, watching her from across the room as if trying to detect the ghost of her thoughts. She kept her expression blank now out of reflex, a neutral canvas on which he could project whatever version of reality he needed. But he had begun slipping and she knew it. The carefully constructed stability of his performance was cracking at the edges. That morning he insisted they eat together in the sunroom, a part of the house rarely used. She noted the detail, an area with no access to outer doors with only a single window, one she had previously confirmed was reinforced from the outside with metal slats. The breakfast was quiet. He asked more questions than usual, not directly accusatory but probing. What had she dreamed of lately? Did she think much about the city? Did she miss anyone? Every answer she gave was stripped of substance, purposefully hollow. She couldn't afford to show longing. Longing implied unfinished ties, loose threads that might tempt her toward escape. She told him she appreciated the quiet, the space, the simplicity of life here. He nodded slowly but said nothing. Later in the day he handed her a new list. Chores. Tasks. It was longer than before and stranger. Not just sweeping or organizing but odd things. Inventory every label in the pantry. Count the nails in the tool drawer. Test every light switch and write down which bulbs flickered. She understood immediately. It was a distraction. A test to keep her occupied and monitored, a way to trace her movements without needing to follow her. So she performed the list with robotic precision, leaving the notes visible, even exaggerating her efforts in places. He wanted proof of obedience and she gave it to him in abundance. But beneath that mask she worked faster. She removed the last screw in the attic panel. She folded extra layers of clothing and stashed them where he wouldn't think to look, in a sealed container labeled cleaning supplies. She memorized the time it took him to make tea. 8 minutes including the boil. Enough time to enter the crawl space. Enough time to close it silently behind her. That night he locked her door from the outside for the first time. She hadn't heard the bolt before, but she heard it now, a soft metallic click at the edge of sleep. It told her everything. He was preparing for something. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was escalation. She couldn't afford to wait and find out. She waited until the house fell into full silence, no footsteps, no lights under the door, no creak of floorboards, and she slipped from her bed. The flashlight in her hand was already taped to reduce noise. She pulled the loose panel from the wall and crawled in, closing the opening behind her. The crawlspace was tighter than she remembered. Dust choked her throat, and splinters scratched her arms as she pulled herself forward. But she kept moving. The flashlight beam was weak and narrow, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. She followed the turns she had mapped in her mind, dragging herself through the shadows toward the attic space above the living room. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. The insulation was thin here, and the boards beneath her shifted with the sound of age. She moved slowly, careful not to let the creaks echo too loudly. Below she could hear him pacing, then talking though not to her. The radio was on, but he wasn't broadcasting. He was listening to something. A recording, perhaps. Or just his own voice played back on loop. She heard the word reset repeated several times. Then silence. She located the ceiling vent she had identified during her earlier recon. It opened to the hallway just above the stairs. If she could drop through it, she would be on the second floor near the fuse box. She used a broken metal ruler she'd kept from the study drawer to pry the latch open. It took longer than she expected, but eventually it gave with a soft pop. She slipped through and landed lightly on her feet, knees bent, breath steady. In the hallway she paused. No sounds. The lights were dim. She crept toward the fuse box and used the spoon handle she had fashioned into a crude locket. It took 3 tries and a panic spike of sound when the tool slipped once, but eventually the door opened. Inside, she saw what she expected, 2 main switches, one of which was labeled internal comm/monitor. Without hesitation, she flipped it down. The house shifted. The faint hum she had grown so used to disappeared. Somewhere behind her, a red light blinked out. She moved fast now. Down the stairs into the study. She went directly to the desk drawer that had held the photographs and pulled it open. Still there. But this time she took them. Evidence. A record. Something to carry if she made it out. She checked the door. Still bolted. But she had seen him unlock it dozens of times. She memorized the sequence: deadbolt, chain, 2 lower latches. And the key. The key he always wore. If she could get it without a sound. She heard movement. Upstairs. He had heard something. She ducked into the side hallway and pressed herself flat against the wall. The key was around his neck. That was the only way out. She remembered the kitchen. He always took off the key when he showered, when he boiled water. She had to get him into the kitchen. She moved quickly, reversing her path, and stepped back into the guest room just as he came around the corner. His face was pale, his eyes wide, lips slightly parted as though he had just seen a ghost. She pretended to be waking, stretching, yawning. He said nothing. He only looked at her for a long time, then turned and walked away. She knew the next part had to happen tonight. There would be no more days. No more fake lists. No more playing along. She waited until she heard the familiar sounds: tea boiling, faucet running. She crept into the hallway again. This time she moved directly behind him. The keychain lay on the counter. He had placed it there, just within reach. She slid it into her hand and retreated. Back in her room, she waited only 5 minutes before making her move. She unlocked the door silently, crept down the hallway, and reached the front entrance. The locks came undone in sequence. The last one made a small metallic snap. Behind her, the house remained still. She opened the door. And the alarm blared. Hidden, wired into the frame, it screamed with a deafening shriek that shattered the silence. Lights burst on. Footsteps thundered behind her. She ran. The scream of the alarm pierced the night with a violence that fractured everything: the illusion, the rhythm, the carefully maintained performance. It wasn't just a sound, it was a signal, a declaration, a final line drawn. The shrill wail echoed through the walls like a mechanical predator calling out across a forest, vibrating through the floorboards and vibrating inside her skull. Her feet were already moving before her mind could catch up. The cold air bit at her skin as she leapt from the porch into the dark, her bare saw slapping against the damp wood, the stolen key clenched in one trembling hand. The trees stood like silent judges at the edge of the property, skeletal branches clawing at the sky, and she ran toward them as though the woods themselves were sanctuary. Behind her, the door slammed open. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She heard the doorframe crack, heard his voice for the first time, not measured or careful or calm, but raw, broken, filled with an urgency that sounded less like anger and more like grief. He was calling her name over and over, but it had become a word without meaning, a noise designed to pull her back into his world, to paralyze her with familiarity. She ignored it. The forest swallowed her fast. Branches whipped at her face, tangled in her hair, tore at her sleeves. The flashlight in her hand shook violently with every step, casting erratic shadows that danced like ghosts across trunks and brush. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't need to. She only knew she had to keep moving. Her legs burned. Her breath came in short, icy bursts. Mud sucked at her feet, leaves tangled in her ankles, and still she ran. Somewhere behind her, his footsteps crashed through the undergrowth. He wasn't calling her name anymore. He was talking to himself again, his voice fractured into fragments of half-phrases, apologies, reassurances, bargaining. He begged for understanding. He begged for her to stop. He cried out that he had protected her, saved her, kept her from the collapse. That they were safe together. That outside meant death. That he had made everything perfect for her. But his voice faded. Either she was gaining ground or he was starting to lose his way in the dark. She dared not stop to listen. Each breath was survival. Each heartbeat a warning drum. The forest seemed endless, but she recognized a shape in the darkness, a line of fencing, rusted and old, but tangible. The edge of the property. Her hope surged. Beyond it, maybe a road. Maybe a farmhouse. Maybe nothing. But even nothing was better than the house. She reached it, climbed quickly, slicing her palm on the jagged wire. Blood mixed with mud. She didn't flinch. She dropped to the other side and kept running. The trees began to thin. The air changed, a less damp, more open. She reached a gravel path and followed it. Her body ached. Her knees buckled with each step, but she forced them forward. In the distance, she saw a glimmer of light, 2, then 3. A porch light. A silhouette of a small structure. A shed or a hunting cabin. She stumbled toward it, vision swimming, lungs screaming. She reached the door and slammed her fist against it. No response. She tried the handle. Locked. She circled around and found a broken window, small but wide enough to squeeze through. She didn't hesitate. She pushed herself in, collapsing onto the dusty floor inside. She waited. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder than the alarm had been. Minutes passed. Then longer. No footsteps. No breath behind her. No shadow at the window. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was dense. Expectant. She curled herself into a corner and waited, flashlight pointed at the door. She didn't sleep. When the sun rose, it did so slowly, filtering through the broken panes with gray light. Her body trembled with cold, her blood sticky on her hand. She stood, limbs aching, and stepped outside. The world looked so normal it made her dizzy. Birds moved through the trees. A breeze ruffled the leaves. She began walking again, slower now, exhausted beyond thought. Hours passed. The road came into view, a real road, with cracked pavement and faded lines. And on the horizon, the shape of a vehicle. She staggered into the middle of the lane, waving both arms, and the car slowed. What followed came in fragments, emergency responders, warmth, blankets, questions she couldn't answer immediately. Her voice came back in fits and starts. The story was told. The house was found. The man was not. He had vanished, leaving behind a home stripped of its facade. In the basement, they found recordings, hours of them, his voice cataloging her every move. Pages and pages of logs. The planning room exactly as she had described it. The photographs. The restraints. It was no longer a question of whether she had been believed. The evidence spoke for her. And yet, even weeks later, even safe, even surrounded by sterile white walls and voices full of concern, she sometimes heard the sound of the key turning. Not in locks she could see, but deep in her memory, where the edges of reality had been bent and stretched and buried. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night expecting to find herself in that house again, the world beyond the door no longer real, her escape nothing but a dream. But each morning the sun came. And each time she stepped outside, the air smelled different. Untamed. Free. She didn't know where he was. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he was still out there, planning, building, waiting. But she knew one thing with a clarity nothing could touch. She had left. She had run. She had made it out. And the world, broken as it was still better than the one he built to replace it.